Okay, well, we'll get started. I'm Nedra Chandler. I'm the Associate Director of the Environmental Dispute Resolution Center at the Waas Stegner Center. So at the EDR program, we exist to cultivate a culture of collaboration on environment and natural resource issues. And we're always quick to point out that that includes a human environment. And we're just so happy that we have these awesome panelists today to place plastics in the context of the broader context of our consumptive lifestyles. So we've got two panels lined up, 4 experts in the first one, and we'll just get right into that. I do want you to know what to expect from me. I will keep my eye on the purpose here and intervene as needed. We've got some pre-recorded and some live. And we will just begin and end on time because some people are popping in and out of sessions. I want to encourage listeners to be sure to open up the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type in questions as they occur to you. You can note that they're for any of our expert panelists that you'll hear from this morning between now and 12:15. And then we're going to kind of crowdsource them because you can hit like of the questions you like, and those will come up to the top and be a nice way for us to engage at the last part of each panel. So with that, I think we'll just get going with Professor Rolf Halden, who is at Arizona State University and co-founder of the nonprofit One Water, One Health. And Professor Halden, we'll cue up your 7-minute video, and then we'll roll right into Ramani Narayan's talk, which won't exceed 15 minutes, then Michael Waas, then Alan Eastman, same deal. Okay? All right, here we go.
Hello, my name is Rolf Halden. I'm a professor at Arizona State University and co-founder of the nonprofit One Water, One Health. How can we together solve the plastic conundrum? That's the big question. Let's take a look. First of all, we have to realize that we all have been fooled for decades. Would you today buy a Ford Model T? A car that has no safety features and is not responding in its design to all of the knowledge that we have accumulated over the past 50 to 70 years. That's exactly the fact with plastics. It's a failed material. It was never intended for mass production. It is made from toxins and produces toxins, and it is very persistent, meaning that it will be there long after we are all gone. Think of your toothbrush. Would you buy a car today that runs on leaded gasoline? Probably not, but we are using plastics that are made from petroleum. Would you buy a car that has no brakes? Probably not, but the plastics we use today have no end-of-life strategy. They will linger on for centuries to millennia, long after we are gone. And did you know that you, in essence, function as a salesperson and influencer for first-generation plastics? Every time you and I pick up a cup of Starbucks coffee with a plastic lid, and we buy our groceries that are packaged in plastics that are persistent, we are perpetuating a mistake that we shouldn't have made in the first place. Well, let's think back of what happens when we made these types of large-scale global mistakes. Think of lead. Lead had a hand in kind of the eclipse of the Roman Empire. The Romans used only about a pound of lead per person per year. We managed in the United States to use over 10 pounds of lead per person per year. How did that serve us? Not very well. We are still paying the dues, and our children are still impacted in their intelligence and their behavior from these past environmental mistakes. Think of a bed that looks like a polymer, like a big macroscopic material. Well, guess what? If it falls apart, it creates a lot of hazards and it creates a lot of costs. So it's estimated that between 2.4 and 3.9 billion dollars are being spent globally in healthcare costs related just to asbestos. If you think that's a lot of money, consider plastics. Plastics are much more abundant than asbestos, and the mass of micro and nanoplastics that are now infiltrating the globe and that cannot be stopped right now is huge, meaning that the costs for plastic pollution will be much, much larger than the cost of lead and asbestos pollution combined. So I hope you agree with me that we have to take action. What does it take to actually get off our plastic addiction? I think that it all begins by having the knowledge that we have in our heads translate into our behavior. That only works if we are addressing our emotions. And right now, I think you and I have to admit that our emotional reaction to plastics is not what it should be, because we should be scared of plastics, but we are not. We allow plastics on our dining tables when indeed it's a material that should be repelling us and should not be in the area when we eat and when we are with our friends and loved ones. We have to, aside from changing ourselves, we have to change the environment. We have to level the playing field. We have to redirect the costs that plastics are causing on society, on you and me, to those people that produce the materials. How do we do that? We could tax the manufacturers, and we could provide a legal framework that holds people responsible. If they produce a material that is known to cause pollution and harm to animals and to people, they should be held liable for that. If we create this framework of responsibility, then we will have actions and progress quickly follow. We have to align the narrative. You and I probably use the word recycling, but recycling is a myth. For plastics, for first generation plastics, there only is downcycling. So there's no true recycling. And whenever you just take something and take the waste and make something else from it, that means that you still have to feed the production line with the petroleum, and you always create new virgin materials, even if you downcycle the waste that is being created. So we have to stop that. We have to talk about downcycling and the continuation of feeding a waste cycle, and we have to break that cycle. And we have to acknowledge, if you start with something toxic, whether it's vinyl chloride or whether it's bisphenol A, you don't arrive at a safe product. So by cutting off the source, we are then in a position to address the tremendous pollution that we have already caused. So we should engage in meaningful cleanup only after we have closed off the supply of global first generation non-biodegradable persistent plastics. Do we know enough to act? Of course we do. You and I know it. But if you ask a scientist about what area they know absolutely everything, they will always say more studies are needed. For every answer that we produce in science, we have 10 new questions that arise. However, for plastics, we definitely know enough. All it takes is for you to take a look outside, take a walk, a stroll along a river, and look at the plastic pollution. Now we have added masks on top of the prior pollution from plastic bottles and other things. It is time to change our ways. One scary fact: if we were to stop plastic pollution today, not a single molecule of monomers would be polymerized to make more first-generation plastics. We would still increase the global inventory of microplastics and nanoplastics for decades, if not centuries. Why? Because all the large plastic particles that are now swimming in the oceans will slowly grind down and degrade over time. And they will increase, meaning that the peak of the pollution is still to come. Not the peak of the macro pollution, but of the micro and nano pollution. And that is the pollution that most likely has the harshest impact on ecosystem as well as human health. In the end, we know we have a failed material. We use it every day, but we have to change our ways. There are ways of addressing it by going to the root cause. And we cannot succeed if we don't change our language and our emotional relationship to this failed materials, first generation plastics. I would say that the choice we have to make is easy. Let's begin today.
Professor Halden, thank you so much for that introduction and also the piece about emotionally connecting, sort of finding the feeling to make change when change is hard. It's very right in line with the theme for today. So thank you. And we'll go right to Ramani Narayan. Narayan, I'm sorry, Professor Narayan. And I'll come back in at the 12-minute mark just to give you the signal that it's time to wrap up, and thank you.
Thank you, Nedra, and pleasure to be here. It's an interesting start to the conversation, so this fits in very well with what I'm going to talk about. And we will discuss the biodegradable compostable plastics and this question of, is biodegradability a solution? So following up, if you walk down any supermarket aisle, well, this is what you see. There is no dearth of plastics. And the question is, do we need the plastics and what does it offer? The point which we cannot forget is plastics plays a very critical role in almost every sector and every supply chain. So if you look at food packaging, they have there to preserve, protect. They're also needed to ensure worker safety, hygiene. And so we as scientists, as material scientists, have to sort of balance the need versus the packaging requirements to protect and preserve and to maintain hygiene. Medical products, you are all familiar in today's environment. The gloves we use, the packaging for that. Clearly, we do need certain protective materials, whether you want to call it plastics or you want to call it something else, but certainly there is need for that. And then what about transportation? Every time you have an automobile, then how do you reduce the energy consumption, the fuel part of it? And agriculture, we are a growing population, and agricultural films dramatically enhances productivity. And then finally, insulation and energy part of it. They're all lightweighting and fuel reductions take place. So clearly, plastics contributes. So what then is the problem, which Rolf pointed out? They are ubiquitous, and there are two issues that needs resolution. One is what I call the end of life. What happens to these ubiquitous, lightweight, persistent, non-biodegradable plastics? They're everywhere, polluting land and oceans. And also the beginning of life, as I call it, that is, can we replace, substitute fossil carbon with plant biomass renewable carbon, right? That is to carbon footprint reductions and all the other associated values with it, okay? Therefore, what solutions do we have? We are scientists, we offer solutions. So one, clearly the consumer, the stakeholders, all of us have to work on this point of no leakage into the ocean or terrestrial environment. We want to minimize or eliminate mismanaged waste. This is a very interesting term because this directly relates to waste management, especially in the emerging developing economy countries of the world. And we do need to provide for managed closed loop circular end of life options. That was what was talked about. And within this context, we talk about biodegradability, compostability, what I call organic biological recycling. And of course, you heard about mechanical chemical recycling, which does not offer it. And right in front of you are examples of non-biodegradable plastics which are used today and which needs change, right? So the mantra which you have seen from every symposium everywhere is this fact: 100% reusable, recyclable, compostable plastics. And specifically, we're saying, I was very pleased to hear the first generation materials, but can we innovate to ensure that 100% of our packaging, and I'm focusing on packaging specifically, can it be easily, safely recycled or composted, right? And the circulate part of it. So I want to focus on that innovation part, which we are talking about. I promise you that this next slide is not meant to scare you. This is not a lesson in chemistry. Hopefully there are chemists, but I'm a teacher. So let's see if I can educate you on this, right? What's the problem with plastic? Why do we we have generalized plastic. So I want to bring you down to the basic, what I call the molecular level of plastics, right? This is the plastic as we know today. It is based on carbon centric, you know that. It is made of carbon-carbon bonds. This is long chains, which is the plastics of today. Interestingly, you might like to know that that molecular structure which I show you, and I replace that R with certain functional groups, 70% of all the plastics produced today can be represented by that structure. And that carbon-carbon bond is the strongest bond we have made. It's difficult to break it down. Microbially, chemically, even with catalysts, we have to go to temperatures of 300 and 400 degrees centigrade. So do we have a chance to change this? And the answer is yes, maybe, right? So I take out that carbon-carbon bond and introduce oxygen functionality. You're familiar with oxygen, and incorporate it into that backbone, which you see there. And I call that an ester backbone. This is a molecule you use every day. Your bottles, your textiles, PET, you've heard that name very much. But because you introduce oxygen, this potentially can be chemically depolymerized or broken down to the initial fragment, and then you can repolymerize. It's essentially a closed loop cycle. So that gives us a option to do certain transformations within the backbone to change where we are today, right? But this is still not biodegradable or compostable or any of the activities of microbes to break it down. But again, if you use the oxygen in the backbone, and again, I show you a ester backbone over here, the red oxygen atoms, and change the groups attached to it, I now have a polyester molecule, we call it, and make sure that the carbon which you're seeing there all come from plant biomass. So now I have created a bio-based molecule, which is polyester, and which will now be acted on by microorganisms easily and be removed from the environment. That would be a holy grail to go after. And here are examples of already in the marketplace. On the left-hand side, you are seeing PLA. PLA is a corn-based, bio-based molecule, which at its end of life, again, it has got that ester oxygen linkage in its backbone, can be recycled if you so choose to. It can be industrially composted, provided you close the loop around it, right? And then you have another oxygen-based transformed molecule. This is made by microbes. This is called PHAs, and will be able to completely biodegrade in the environment, right? So here are examples of how we can change the molecule. And the question is, are we willing to make that change? Will the major companies switch from this carbon-carbon backbone to these kinds of new molecules because you're already manufacturing it and you don't want to change it? So we are pushing everything down to recycling, end of life, but not willing to change that molecule. And that is my submission to this group to consider, right? And the last one I want to share with you is another oxygen molecule, oxygen in the structures. This is cellulose, and this is paper. And we know it is biodegradable. It's been around our trees. Nature has designed cellulose, lignocellulosic, which at its end of life breaks down and becomes part of nature. So we have examples of how we can learn from nature and do these transformations. All right. The key point we have already talked about here is that we can change that molecular structure. We can do things to it. And this is where I think we slip up. Unfortunately, the end of life of biodegradability cannot be designed at the molecular level. You need to understand the characteristics of the receiving biological environment, and the whole system then dictates whether something will biodegrade and be persistent or be completely removed from the environment. So unless we combine the two in our understanding, like what temperature of the biological environment, am I going to use compost? Should I use anaerobic digestion? Is it going to be sand? Is it soil? Is it land, ocean? So unless you define the biological system in combination with the structure and bring both together, then only we have a solution to end of life of plastics. You want to call it whatever you want, but something which will help protect, preserve the product's integrity, protect the workers, protect the consumer, right? And finally, this is where all the problems come up, is you need to document, validate that carbon, we are a carbon-centric society, right? Or we ourselves are carbon molecules, right? So can you document that the carbon of your polymer is completely removed from the environment by microorganisms in a time frame that is realistic, and there is no remnant polymer, and that is documented if you can demonstrate 90% removal. And there are standards, there are test methods. The question is, we need to impose those standards and make sure this is done, right? So this is possible. And if you want to prove, there are other ways you can carbon label it, and you can look at the respirometric analysis and so on and so forth. But I want to leave you with this, that yes, you can design it. It has to be done in the context of an end of life, and that 90% plus conversion should be documented. And we can talk more in detail later on. So this is a more technical stuff. But if I take a flask, I give it the microorganisms, whether it's from soil or compost, don't give it any other carbon food except your test material. And if the microorganisms are capable of utilizing it, then you should see CO2, which is the biological endpoint. And if that happens, then you know, and what percent of that has converted, that will give you an estimate of complete removal from the environment, okay? And then finally, therefore, is biodegradability a solution to plastics end of life? I would submit to you, the answer is yes, provided you have a managed closed loop disposal system like composting or anaerobic digestion, or in case of agriculture, the soil. But the red words, complete removal from the environmental compartment in a short time defined by that environment. That is what is needed, and that's what people are working to, but it's going to take a lot more time and effort. Finally, in the short time I have, I want to introduce to you between why does this make sense, right? Remember that 50% of the municipal solid waste stream today, right, is food, paper, and biodegradable organic waste. We send this to a landfill. In our wisdom, we are preserving garbage for posterity. And in a landfill, when these food and other waste breakdowns generate methane, which is 25x a global warming potential. So shouldn't we take this organic waste, forget plastics for the time being, these wastes are to be sent to an industrial composting facility. And oh, by the way, the CO2 evolved is going to be fixed by the next biomass plantation or crop you fix. And this is documented that if you recover this biodegradable organic waste, let's say 1.84 million tons, you will result in a 1.74 million ton CO2 equivalence greenhouse gas reduction. So perfectly, this makes sense. Therefore, I submit to you that plastics associated with food, paper, and biodegradable organic waste should enter into a composting facility along with food and paper, and therefore offer a solution to it, rather than saying that we will recover this from this food waste and go towards recycling. And lastly, we cannot therefore come with a magical biodegradable solution that if you throw it into ocean or land, magically it's going to go away. Therefore, we need to test it in those environments to provide the stakeholders what is the estimated time of life in that environment, right? So I think I am very close to my 15 minutes, and I will stop here and welcome any questions or comments. And I'll just leave this with you, that and put that as a question to you, which saying that unqualified use of the word biodegradable, which seems to proliferate in this marketplace, is wrong, is misleading and deceptive. But that should not preclude the development of truly biodegradable, compostable packaging materials that is useful to us and can protect and preserve the product, as well as protect the workers and the end consumer. So thank you very much for the time given to me and the opportunity to present.
Wonderful. Professor Narayan, thank you. And it's a beautiful queuing up of our next panelist. You'll have questions at the end of the four, so we've got two more speakers before we do Q&A. I want to take a moment to Michael Waas is going to come online. He's the president in North America for TIPA, and so a compostable packaging organization, and so that was a perfect cue up of Professor Narayan. I would like to encourage listeners. I see we've got about 8 questions in the Q&A. I would like you to encourage you to look there and offer questions, and also like the questions of others. And we'll get started with Michael Waas.
Hi, my name is Michael Waas. I'm the Vice President of North America for TIPA. I would like to thank the staff and faculty of the Stegner Center for the invitation to speak with you today. I'm honored to be here with the other panelists and excited to talk about national and global solutions to the waste crisis with you today. TIPA is a company that was founded to address the challenge of flexible plastic packaging waste by taking inspiration from nature. Because as much as it seems that the waste crisis is insurmountable, the reality is that it is a recent crisis. For the entire history of the natural world up until about the 20th century, there really was no waste. Natural materials all returned to the earth and biodegraded in a way that ensured every natural system was circular. It wasn't until the advent of plastics that we see the roots of the waste crisis. And combined with the post-war economy, we have seen an unprecedented surge of new and highly complex materials. Now, ads like the ones you're seeing that extolled the virtue of disposable products and packaging might make us all cringe now. But it's important that we remember why plastics and disposable products were so revolutionary. They made it possible to manufacture products more cheaply. Plastic packaging also makes it possible to keep food fresh longer, and food waste is one of the largest areas of carbon footprint. Plastic also made day-to-day life more convenient for people, or at least it felt that way at the time, and still does sometimes. But the inevitable result of that convenience is that the global production of plastic has increased at an exponential rate. Globally, production of plastic has increased 20-fold in the last 50 years. Currently, hundreds of millions of tons of plastic are produced annually, and that volume is expected to quadruple by 2050. Now, the challenge is that of all of that plastic, of all the plastic ever produced, less than 9% has been recovered and reused. Today, only 14% of plastic packaging is collected for recycling, and only 5% of plastic packaging actually ends up being used again. This means that we are in a very linear system where natural resources like oil are pulled out of the ground to create virgin materials and products. And then at the end of their natural, useful life, those products and that packaging inevitably go to one of two places, primarily landfill or incineration. This includes the vast majority of products that are labeled with one of the Chasing Arrow recycling logos, because more than 90% of all of the plastic that goes into municipal systems still ends up going to landfill or incineration. And of course, an alarming amount of plastic waste also ends up as litter and contaminates beaches and oceans and waterways. And in fact, based on current rates, it's estimated that there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish by 2050. As a result of that volume of plastic being present, we are now seeing microplastics in all levels of ecosystems globally. So in a short 75 to 80 years, we have managed to overwhelm a balance that had been maintained by the natural world for millennia. And while I have no doubt that the natural world will adapt eventually, I really think the question is whether humans will be around long enough to see that. Now, you're probably asking yourself why more plastic doesn't get recycled. After all, I'm sure everyone at this conference diligently sorts and cleans all of your plastic and glass and paper products and sends them to the municipal recycling system. But the challenge with recycling is with the economics of the recycling system. Currently, only materials with a high residual material value, which is what the recycler can sell the recovered material for, only those products with a high material value actually get recycled. And while the type of material has an impact on that value, so whether a plastic is 1 or 2 or 4 or 7, there are also other factors like the color of the product and the size and the shape. And in fact, flexible packaging is one of the most challenging types of plastic to recycle. As a result, less than 10% of the plastic collected through municipal recycling systems actually ends up recycled. The vast majority of the recyclable material ends up in landfill or incineration, because while it is technically recyclable, it doesn't actually end up being practically recyclable because of the economics. So if there are major challenges with recycling, what are some other options? TIPA has developed a compostable, flexible packaging that is inspired by the simplicity of nature's circular systems, because it is designed to break down and biodegrade and return back to soil. But it has been developed to also provide the same performance benefits that conventional plastics provide when it comes to things like shelf life and creating an oxygen barrier, because it is important to provide the same performance as traditional plastics in order to compete in the marketplace. But it is also crucial to provide a sustainable end of life. And so TIPA packaging will be compostable. And so when you use a product that's been packaged with TIPA flexible packaging, you can then take it and send it to your local compost or put it in your own compost bin. And in 6 or 12 months, that packaging will break down along with the other organic material in your compost. This is a crucial innovation and provides a compelling solution to traditional plastics. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to the discussion with the other panelists.
Thank you, Michael. Wonderful. And we're headed into the fourth and final national and global solutions panelist, Alan Eastman. If you could stand by, Michael, we'll have questions and answers by, I'm going to say 10:35. We'll be doing that. Alan is a PhD chemist, and as he likes to say, a dabbler in all things related to the chemistry and science of the world we live in. And Alan, just like we agreed, I'll stick my face on the screen with you when it's time to wrap up. And I appreciate your flexibility. It's really great to have this combination of pre-recorded and live people. So take it away, Alan.
Thank you. No problem at all. It's really a pleasure to have been invited to share with you some of my history and background. It's also interesting to be in a symposium where the first presentation, the keynote speaker, had the temerity to write a paper entitled Production, Use, and Fate of All Plastics Ever Made, and the technical chops to back it up. What I'd like to talk about is the other 60% and what we do for the long term. You know, the problem with plastics that we've talked about at length during the symposium is mostly packaging, that 40% or 45% or so. That turns out to be mostly 4 big resins: polyethylene, polyethylene terephthalate, polypropylene. That's about it. There are, however, as you can see in this slide, lots and lots of different resins that are made and lots of different applications. We've talked about mostly packaging, but there are hundreds of different resins used in that other 60% of plastic usage. That's the sort of thing I'd like to talk about. Discarded used plastic is the big problem. Recycling, we've heard, is difficult to impossible. A lot of solutions have been proposed. The plastics really have to be so intractable. Hence the look at bioplastics, degradable, compostable plastics that a couple of the other panelists today have talked about. What about the other 60%? We really don't think sometimes how much plastics have become a part of the life that we live. If you look around at the room you're sitting in right now and try and just take a look and see what things are made out of plastics. Most of them are not packaging. The glasses I have on have plastic lenses. The computer I'm typing on has plastic keys, a plastic frame. Look in my automobile, my cell phone has a plastic case. And then there are the internal ones. I have a couple artificial shoulders, plastic bearing surfaces on artificial limbs. There are just innumerable ways that plastics are used. What do we do about that other 60%? The other question that has come up is polymers are typically made from oil and gas. What happens as oil and gas is phased out? Can we make the polymers that we want from materials that aren't fossil fuels? Professor Narayan has talked about those. Michael Waas talked about some others. There are some things that we can do. The one big problem with everything we do with plastics is that just eliminating them isn't really a good solution. There's one of those tongue-in-cheek laws that says any solution that depends on ignoring or transforming human nature is not a solution. Now, that's not entirely true, but I'd like you to think about what that means. We are asking people to change something that has become second nature to them. No matter what we do, this isn't going to happen all at once, and we need to make it attractive for people to consider, how do I get rid of the plastics that I'm using that I shouldn't be? Which plastics can I get rid of? Which ones do I want to keep? For the most part, people have not even thought about that. And this symposium is a good way to get people to start to think. But I noticed from the attendance list at this symposium, there are roughly 1 million people in the Salt Lake Valley. And the attendance at this symposium is a tiny, tiny fraction of that. How do we get that message out to people? let me make a couple predictions on what is going to happen with that other 60%. Most of those resins are going to be produced continually for the near future, and probably many of them for the far future as well, no matter what happens to plastics used in packaging. Some of those resins usage will fade as substitutes with fewer problems are found. Something like PVC, problems with the plasticizers, the phthalates. Incineration is a problem because you make very nasty things you don't want to make when you incinerate chlorinated hydrocarbons. And vinyl chloride monomer is not a good actor. Nevertheless, PVC is almost irreplaceable for some uses. But even so, some substitutes like PEX will make inroads in water systems and so on, where their properties make them much better than the metals they replace, much cheaper. And is PEX recyclable? Well, it's polyethylene, basically cross-linked polyethylene. Maybe incinerating it is the best thing to do with it. Polycarbonate usage was going to go down. There are problems with BPA, that's bisphenol A. It's the monomer used to make that polymer. There have been some substitutes that have been tried, not very successfully. I don't see polycarbonate use continuing because there are some substitutes that work. Fluorocarbons, the big problems with the PFOAs. You may have seen the movie Dark Water that talks about the problems there. Problems with fluorocarbons, but they're almost irreplaceable for some uses. They will continue to be used. Some specialty grades will continue to be used and their use will expand. Some polyolefins like PMP, that's a polycarbonate substitute. PMP, by the way, is used in clear measuring cups and so on. It handles high temperature and is nice and clear like polycarbonate. Composites, specialty fibers, a lot of those things will still be around. It's possible to make ethylene, the starting material for a lot of plastics, from alcohols. You can do that. I'm going to skip this slide simply because of time. But plastics from non-fossil fuel sources, the terminology is kind of misleading. When you say bioplastic, you mean one of three things. One is a plastic manufactured from biologically based raw materials, like bio-PET that Professor Narayan talked about. A plastic that's biodegradable. We've heard a lot of talk about that. That's also a bioplastic, but there's another one, and that's a plastic that contains natural fibers. So Trex synthetic boards are simply polyethylene plus sawdust, but some people call that a bioplastic. The amount of those that are made, they fit in several different categories. Only the one at the upper right is what we want, that's both biodegradable and bio-based. So let's be careful when people talk about bioplastics to know exactly what it is they're talking about. The other problem is that not much of that stuff is made right now. The bio-based and biodegradable plastics are in the red zones on this diagram. The total world capacity is about 8 million tons. Total world capacity for conventional plastics is about 400 million tons. We've got a ways to go. What we really need, people have talked about the magic bullet, the solution, but there is no such thing. There's a phrase that I like: for every complex and difficult problem, there is a simple, elegant solution, and it doesn't work. So what do we need? We don't need a magic bullet. What we need is a magic shotgun. Yes, we need to find and use more recyclable plastics. Yes, we need to decrease the use of plastics altogether. Yes, we need to recycle as much as we can. Yes, we need to ban single-use plastics. Yes, we need to keep using some plastics. Yes, we need renewable raw materials. Yes, we need new and better bioplastics. We should not panic. There is a problem, but we must move forward. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Alan Eastman. And so what we'll do now, this has been a great introduction for national and global solutions. I see 13 questions in the queue and really about 4 or 5 specifically for Professor Narayan, which I think what we'll do is Yeah, well, if I could have Michael Waas come back on too, if he's here. Let me see. And we'll just have a little, here he comes, great. So you can see them too if you open the Q&A, but don't feel like you have to. Let's start with Dr. Narayan, because I know you've been active in the Q&A. If you could maybe address them one by one and say which one you're addressing. Would you be willing?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
I think the most important, interesting question comes from Robert Adler, right? As your Utah professor.
Correct.
He brought up the issue, and I'll read the question out, whether plant-based plastics compete with food production in the use of finite agricultural land, and talks about feeding of the people and so on and so forth. Not my opinion, this is the biggest myth and misperception we can talk about in terms of materials, right? So separate transportation fuels, which I'm not talking about. I'm talking about just bioplastic materials, good bioplastics materials. And let's take the number 358 million metric tons total production. I submit to each and every one of you, don't need to be a good mathematician. 359 million metric tons, all manufactured from PLA. Let's assume that. It's never going to happen. Well, let's do that. I'm sure the PLA manufacturing companies would love that scenario. All right, let's do that. And then ask, how much bushels of corn do we need and how much land do we need to produce enough PLA to put 359 million metric tons? The math says that you will require less than 5% of the agricultural land to produce all of that. So there seems to be a total disconnect between this issue. Yes, this issue is correct if you say, I want to convert all the transportation fuels into biofuels. Absolutely, this will be a nightmare. And that's why EU and all say that they kind of parcel out how much biofuels you can make. But for making plastics, it's just a noise in the whole issue. And then finally, I would like to submit that this is where the mix happens, that the petroleum industry is based on fuel and materials. That's what the refinery is based on. And that's why everybody mixes material production with fuel production. In the case of the biorefinery, and you can look it up, they are focused on food production and industrial product production. And if you have both, it certainly benefits the farmer. And as everybody knows today, we tell farmers not to grow more corn, for example, right? There is a ban on, they get what they call pay in kind, which is being removed slowly, but you get paid not to be productive. So I think that this seems to be a big myth and misperception, and I have no idea how you solve this and how do you.
There's so much complexity in this whole conversation, and you four had this beautiful task of situating plastics in the context of our consumptive lifestyles and national global solutions. So I want to go big picture with you, and let's just get back to some of the questions here that any one of you could address. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A to stay on schedule now. So the first question asked was, are we addicted to plastics? What do we do about, what kind of rehab do we need? Any of you have anything you want to offer? I see Professor Halden.
Thanks, Nedra. Yeah. So are we addicted to plastics? I think a lot of us cannot, even imagine a life without it. And addiction is defined as a behavior that is harmful to yourself and to others around you, but you cannot stop it. Plastics fit nicely into this, unfortunately, as we cannot imagine a life without it. Yet the plastics are hurting us in various ways. And so admitting that is a first step. I really liked Dr. Eastman's summary of that we need a shotgun approach here, that we need multiple solutions. It's not one, But have you noticed, I mean, I talk about the narrative and see, we are back to talking about recycling, and we are continuing the lie, the myth that this material is recyclable. None of those cups, paper lids, or the plastic cups are actually coming back to become a plastic lid on your next drink. It's all downcycling, and we still have to feed, you know, the virgin material in order to make this. So I also like the biodegradable, non-biodegradable. Yeah, the lie of creating bio-based plastics that look exactly like the first generation, only that they are made from a material that's now competing with the food production. That is horrible. So we gotta get honest here, and we are addicted. And as you know, addicts don't like to admit, but we got to make that first step.
And, you know, keeping with this theme, and I'd love to hear from Michael Waas or Alan Eastman this time, just about sort of, so can you paint a picture of this national, global kind of solution, compelling picture? Where are we headed? You know, who needs to do what at that scale? Either one of you, Michael or Alan, or both.
I'm happy to add a few thoughts in that. Well, I don't have the solution. I think it's interesting, and a couple of other people, Professor Halden and Narayan, have already mentioned there is not one solution. There needs to be a multifaceted solution. And I think when we're looking at solutions and potential solutions, there's a variety of ways to move this. And I think in the United States, we are seeing a lack of regulatory solutions in the way that abroad, and particularly in Europe, there are well-developed extended producer responsibility, EPR regulations requiring companies to pay a tax or a fee for the non-recyclable or disposable packaging they produce. We're not seeing that same kind of regulatory environment in the US, but we are seeing demands from consumers turn into commitments from corporations. And I can tell you that right now, most major consumer packaged goods corporations, all of which you're familiar with and products you buy, have made commitments to go to recyclable or compostable packaging by 2025 or 2030. And that's because they're seeing the demand from consumers. And so I think that's one of the most important things for everyone to remember, is that every single day with every purchase we make, we are voting with our dollars, and companies listen to that. It's why there are those packaging commitments, not because suddenly there is a crisis when there wasn't one 15 years ago. The crisis was there and companies were aware, but there wasn't the same kind of market demand. And so I'd encourage people to keep that in mind as you're making purchasing decisions for yourself and your household.
If I could add a little bit to that, Michael, that one of the first laws of government is tax what you want less of, subsidize what you want more of. And in our free market economy, people tend to make decisions based on cost. So the way to encourage individual people to change the way they do things is to make it more expensive to do the things that we do not want to happen, and less expensive to do the things that we do want to happen. That can only come at a governmental level, national, international. The laws of the sea, for example, could be modified a little bit to ban more of the plastics that are ending up in the sea. But the biggest thing is that first law of economics. People tend to buy what is less expensive for them. If we can make what's bad for them more expensive, that works.
Does that mean policy change, Dr.
Absolutely.
Eastman?
Absolutely. And policy change in a democracy like ours is driven by people writing to their congressmen, their representatives. That doesn't work nearly as well as a phone call, by the way. There are a lot of companies, a lot of NGOs will send out suggested letters. Skip those suggested letters. Make up your own. It has much more impact than just mimeographing something else.
You'll hear from the local panel that starts in 5 minutes some of these same themes about, you know, how local activism works. I want to give you all the airtime you can get. If you found a question you want to address, please do. Just butt in. If you'd like to have some parting thoughts in the next 5 minutes that you share now, you're certainly welcome to stick around, you know, until 12:30 as well, but not expected. No judgment.
If I could answer maybe the one that Raymond Wixom asked, he says, if the world population decided today that we're swearing off plastic, what will the case of the computer monitor I'm watching this presentation be made of? The keys on my keyboard, on my mouse. I'm not willing to live without these things or some substitute that works at least as well. What replaces plastic? And the answer to that in a lot of cases is that remains to be seen. Some things will go back to what we used before plastic, metal cans, wood, but I think in the long run, we're going to see better plastics that are compostable, that are, at least for the short term, some will continue to be the plastics that we're used to with slightly differing properties. It's not going to be an all at once change, but look forward to change and be ready to embrace it as it comes.
Well, let's give each of you a minute. Dr. Narayan, thank you.
I would, for my minute, I would answer this question of Marianne. How would municipalities or individuals have to change collection practices and disposal facilities? I think this is the key, the waste management disposal system. 50% is food biodegradable waste. Today we send it to a landfill or we dump it. And therefore, in order to manage that, you need to provide for composting, anaerobic digestion facilities. And therefore, the plastics and other associated with that could be made compostable. So what is needed is what the other part of this group can do. Can you have laws in place and where composting is mandated, right? Food waste should not go to a landfill. It's very simple. Divert food waste from landfills to composting. That itself will create the infrastructures to pull the plastics associated with that to be compostable, right? So that means almost 40% of your packaging plastics can be transformed and removed from the environment through composting. So those are things that can happen.
On that compostable theme, Michael, you're up.
Yeah, well, just to build on that, I think it's helpful if we take a step back and look more broadly. There are really two steps to solving waste. There's a collection and infrastructure challenge, and then there's a solution challenge. Some materials like aluminum or glass, both of those are solved because the economics of the material are enough, they're sufficient to cover the cost of both of those. Plastics, we've got a great, not great, but strong infrastructure to collect it, but there is no end market for the material. And that's where compostable materials have almost the opposite challenge, where the end challenge, the end solution is solved, but now it's time to build the infrastructure similar to plastic to yield the full, compostable solution.
Can I ask a quick question? There are some.
No, actually, let's not do that. Let's have Rolf's minute. Professor Halden. Thanks, Professor Halden.
Thanks. Yeah, so the situation of plastics is not unique. It is a very complex societal issue. The trap is we get lost in the weeds and we don't look at the obvious solution, the one thing that we really need to fix, and then everything else will fall into place. The answer to that is externalities. The embedded cost of plastics is not given back to the manufacturer, to the people that give us those plastics, meaning that you can make profits while you destroy and create, external costs that by far exceed the value of the product you make. If we close that, if we bring the liability and the cost that is incurred by the plastics back to the people who manufacture, the problem will go away so quickly you have no idea. Right now, the people are not being, the manufacturers of the plastics are not held responsible for the damage they do to society. And that's what we need to change.
Lots of ideas here about the levers. What are the leverage points? Thank you so much for your flexibility. All right. Well, we'll see you at 12:30. Looking forward to it.